They said he would be a burden. My own son looked at me that night, his voice flat and final, and said, "Mom, a blind child will drag this family down. We'll never have a normal life again." That sentence has stayed in my mouth for decades, bitter like metal, impossible to swallow, and impossible to forget. The kind of sentence that doesn't bruise, it brands. I was 62 then, still quick on my feet, still believing that the universe had a logic to it, that compassion could be taught, that kindness was a muscle you could help another person build. But when he said those words, something invisible in the room shifted. You could almost hear the hinge give way, like a door closing on a part of our lives I wasn't ready to lose. I remember standing in that dim kitchen, the smell of cooling pasta still in the air, the baby monitor humming faintly on the counter, and realizing that nothing I knew about my son was as solid as I thought. It was like watching a familiar face tilt ever so slightly until the features no longer aligned with the person you believed you'd raised. I'm 78 now, living alone in a small rented cottage with crooked floors and windows that groan at night. And I have learned to enjoy the sound of things being honest. Old houses do not pretend. They creak when they ache. They let the wind in without apology. They lean a little to the left if that's how they were built. There is comfort in that kind of sincerity. Maybe that's why I chose this place. With paint peeling in the corners and the scent of rain soaked into the wood, because nothing in it lies. Nothing tells me I'm imagining things. Nothing asks me to be smaller, quieter, or more convenient. It's the first place in my long life where I sleep without rehearsing the arguments I never voiced. The ones that used to tighten in my chest when the house of my son filled with silence. The heavy kind, the disapproving kind, the kind that makes you understand you are present but not welcome. But the memory of that night, the night he called his newborn son a weight, pulls at me even now. I can still see him leaning against the refrigerator, arms crossed, phone lighting up with congratulatory messages from people he wanted to impress. He didn't look like a father who'd just met his child. He looked like a man cataloging losses before they'd even occurred, tallying up the inconveniences, calculating how much of his life would be consumed by a child who would never see his face. The cruelty wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It moved quietly, like a draft under a door, subtle enough that if you weren't paying attention, you might convince yourself it wasn't there at all. But I felt it in my skin, in that place beneath the ribs that recognizes danger before the brain does. I didn't answer him right away. I remember pressing my palm flat against the counter just to feel something solid, something that wouldn't shift beneath me. The kitchen light flickered, a failing bulb we kept meaning to replace, and for a moment the whole room was washed in a faded yellow glow. Like an old photograph, the kind where faces blur at the edges and you can't tell if the people in it are happy or simply posing. He kept talking, pacing, building a case against a child who had barely drawn breath, using words like responsibility and limitation, as if the baby in the next room were a verdict and not a life. Every sentence he said made me smaller, not because I believed him, but because I couldn't recognize the boy I had raised, the boy who used to cry when a stray dog looked hungry, the boy who once spent an hour searching the backyard for a fallen fledgling, the boy who said, at 7 years old, "Mom, if someone is scared, you should never make them feel alone." He didn't know I remembered those things, or maybe he did and chose to forget them himself. People sometimes erase parts of their past just to live with what they've become. But I stood there, listening, and felt myself aging in a single instant. as if those words, burden, drag, never normal, had taken a blade to the faith I'd carried for decades. For a long, terrible moment, I wondered if this was my fault, if I had done something wrong in raising him, if empathy was a seed I had failed to water correctly. But then the baby cried, just a soft, needful sound, and everything in me lifted like a candle catching flame. Something warm pushed through the numbness, something stubborn and old and distinctly mine. I walked past my son without a word, went into the small room where the baby lay, and I saw him. Tiny fists curled, eyes closed forever but face open in the way only newborns can be, soft and trusting, breathing the way new life breathes, unaware that anyone had already decided he was too heavy to carry. I leaned over the crib and felt something in me reroot. There was no sorrow in me, not then. There was only fierce clarity, the kind that comes when the world finally shows itself without disguise. I touched his hand. 2 fingers was all it took, and he wrapped them with surprising strength, as if claiming me in return. I whispered something I don't even remember, maybe just his name, maybe nothing at all. But in that moment, I knew I would never let him believe what his father had said. I would never let those words become the story of his life. If the world wanted to dim him, I would be the flame that refused to go out. If the world wanted to shrink him, I would be the voice telling him he could fill any room he entered, even in darkness. Years have turned since that night. Years with edges I did not see coming. Years during which love twisted, families fractured, and loyalties were tested in ways I never imagined. But if you want to understand the beginning, if you want to understand how a woman like me can stand here now, watching that same child step into the highest court in the country with more confidence than men who can see the world with both eyes, you must first understand how darkness entered the house, not through the child born blind, but through the man who saw everything and chose not to look. Only then does the rest of the story make sense. Only then can you understand why I stayed, why I fought, and why, even now, in this old cottage with its crooked floors, I can finally breathe without bracing for someone else's disappointment. The catalyst was not a single moment, but a slow, deliberate unraveling that began the day the doctor placed a folder on the edge of my son's kitchen table and cleared his throat the way men do when they are about to deliver news they would rather avoid. And yet, what struck me wasn't the diagnosis itself. Congenital blindness, non-degenerative, stable, but irreversible. It was the way Daniel's face emptied out, as if the words had scooped something vital from him and left only the shell of a man. Rehearsing his disappointment, the doctor kept speaking in careful, padded sentences about mobility training, sensory development, early intervention programs, and the extraordinary neuroplasticity of infants. But my son heard none of it. He sat stiffly, jaw set, eyes darting. Across the table, as if trying to locate the life he had imagined and realizing it had slipped out through some crack while he wasn't watching, Carla sat beside him, pale and trembling, one hand clutching the sleeve of his shirt as though fear were something she needed to anchor physically. But even she looked more afraid of Daniel's reaction than of the future itself. And in that moment, he understood that the real storm had nothing to do with blindness and everything to do with the fault lines that diagnosis had exposed. The baby lay sleeping in the car seat on the floor, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket someone from Carla's church had knitted, his eyelids fluttering lightly as if he were dreaming of light he would never see. And I remember thinking how gentle he looked, how peaceful, how utterly untouched by the dread gathering around him like fog. I bent to adjust the blanket, more out of instinct than necessity, and caught the doctor watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Sympathy, maybe, or gratitude that someone in the room seemed capable of absorbing the news without collapsing under it. When he left, leaving behind brochures, contact numbers, and a warm-feeling reassurance that children like my grandson live rich, full, brilliant lives, the silence that followed was so sharp it felt like a snapped bone. Daniel exhaled slowly, a sound halfway between a sigh and a grunt, then looked at me with a heaviness that felt like accusation even before he spoke. "Mom," he said, "you heard him. You heard what this means. This is going to take everything, every minute, every bit of energy. It's not the life we planned." I wanted to tell him that no parent gets the life they planned, that children arrive as they are, not as the fantasies we build around them. But he was staring at the wall as though trying to rewrite the narrative in real time, and I sensed that any truth I offered would only ricochet off the fortress he was already building around his disappointment. Carla started to cry softly, the kind of restrained crying people do when they think they should apologize for it, and Daniel pulled his hand away from hers, not cruelly, but distractedly, as though her fear were an inconvenience rather than something a husband might want to soothe. He stood up abruptly and walked to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter with both hands, shoulders bent, the posture of someone absorbing a blow he didn't believe he deserved. And then he said it, not loudly, but with the clarity of someone stating a fact he expected the room to accept without debate. "He'll always need us, Carla. He'll never be independent. This changes everything." Carla shook her head, insisting weakly that the doctor had said otherwise, but Daniel's voice grew tighter, almost clinical, as if he were listing defects in a piece of damaged property. "He'll never drive. He'll never play sports. Schools will, I don't know. He'll need special treatment. And people are cruel, you know they are. He'll be pitied, or mocked, or ignored completely. And we'll be the ones dealing with it, carrying it, every day, forever." Something in me buckled at the sound of that word, forever, because he said it not with fear or sadness, but with resentment, as though his son's existence had become a life, sentence handed down by some cosmic judge. I stepped toward him then, not to argue, but to reach for some thread of empathy I hoped was still buried in him somewhere. Yet when I spoke, my voice came out steadier and colder than I expected. "He needs love, Daniel, not forecasting. He's 2 weeks old. You're already talking like the world is over." He turned, eyes glassy but hard, and shook his head as if I didn't understand the scale of the catastrophe he'd constructed in his mind. "You don't get it, Mom. You don't get how much this will take. We're not young. We're not rich. We're already stretched thin. And now—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The weight of what he refused to say hung between us like smoke. He meant, now we're trapped. The baby stirred in his seat, a tiny, soft sound that broke me more than Daniel's words ever could, because innocence has a way of heightening cruelty by contrast. Carla, in her panic, started flipping through the brochures the doctor left behind, as if there might be a second diagnosis hidden somewhere. A misprint, a softer truth, an alternate path. But her eyes kept glossing over the pages, unable to absorb anything. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that blindness is not a curse, that some of the sharpest minds I've ever encountered have lived in darkness, that her child could grow into someone astonishing if given half a chance. But Daniel interrupted her, fumbling with a harsh whisper. "Stop reading that. It doesn't matter what they say. They don't know what real life looks like." He sounded tired, older than his years, as if all the hope he'd stored for fatherhood had evaporated in the space of an hour, leaving behind a bitter residue he didn't know how to process. And yet beneath all that exhaustion, there was something uglier, a fear of being judged, of having a son who didn't fit the mold, who might make him look weak or unlucky or flawed. When he finally looked at me again, something in his expression had shifted from shock to calculation, and that frightened me more than any outburst would have. "Mom," he said slowly, "we're going to need help. A lot of help. You're going to have to be around more. Maybe a lot more." That was the moment I realized the direction the tide was turning. Not toward unity or shared responsibility, but toward a quiet outsourcing of everything he didn't want to carry. He wasn't asking me to help. He was asking me to absorb the parts of his life he found unmanageable. And there was something else, too, something unspoken but heavy in the air. The implication that if I did not step in fully, completely, without question, the child's life might become a kind of collateral damage in their inability to cope. I felt an anger rise in me then. Not the hot, thrashing kind, but a deep, anchored fury that grows in the marrow, the kind that comes when someone mistakes your love for obedience. I looked at him and saw not the boy I raised, but a man shrinking from his own fatherhood, trying to push the responsibility onto the woman who had spent her entire life lifting others. The catalyst wasn't the diagnosis. It was the realization that my grandson's biggest obstacle was not his blindness, but the fear shrinking his parents' world to something small and suffocating. I leaned down, lifted the baby from his seat, and held him close, feeling the warmth of him against my chest, the steady rhythm of his breath grounding me. His head rested in the curve of my neck as if he knew instinctively where safety lived. I whispered to him, not words of comfort, but a promise that neither of us was ready to understand fully, that I would not let him grow in the shadow of someone else's fear, that he would know love unconditioned, expansive, and fierce, the kind that does not dim when life becomes complicated. When I straightened and looked at my son again, his eyes flickered with something sharp, maybe confusion, maybe resentment, maybe the brief recognition that the future he imagined was slipping out of his hands. He didn't know it yet, but that moment sealed a truth I would live for years to come. If he would not fight for his son, then I would. If he would not see the child clearly, then I would become the eyes that refused to close. And in that simple act, holding a newborn while a grown man folded inward, the course of all our lives quietly, irrevocably changed. I didn't realize how quietly a situation can worsen until the weeks after the diagnosis began folding over one another like damp pages in a book left out in the rain, each day seeming harmless on its own, yet carrying the faint, sour smell of something slowly spoiling beneath the surface, something no one wanted to look at directly. The doctors had given us pamphlets and numbers. The early intervention team had scheduled their first visit. Neighbors had dropped off casseroles wrapped in foil as if blindness were an illness cured by kindness in aluminum trays. but inside Daniel's house. The atmosphere tightened like a cord pulled inch by inch, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. It began with the way he handled the baby, not rough, not negligent, but distant, always passing him off to Carla or to me with an exaggerated sigh, as though the tiny weight in his arms contained a secret he wasn't prepared to learn. He stopped lingering near the crib, stopped humming those tuneless little melodies he used to hum while changing diapers, and instead moved around the house like a man wishing the walls would whisper instructions on how to resume a life he no longer recognized. Carla, fragile and exhausted, attempted to fill the spaces he left behind, but in doing so, she stretched herself thin, her patience fraying at the edges until she snapped at small things: an unwashed bottle, a misplaced bib, a diaper bag that wasn't zipped properly, and then immediately apologized, insisting she was just tired, that she didn't mean anything by it. She grew quieter, too, offering fewer smiles, avoiding mirrors, drifting through the days like a figure carved from tension instead of bone. And in the midst of all this, I found myself stepping into roles I hadn't been asked to fill, but felt compelled to take up. Lifting the baby from his crib in the mornings before either parent stirred, rocking him during his fussy spells, singing to him in the low, soothing voice I used on Daniel when he was small and afraid of thunderstorms. I told myself I was simply helping, being a good mother, a good grandmother, but some nights, when the house had finally gone still and I sat alone in the living room listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, I wondered if I was compensating for an absence neither of them wanted to admit was there. The first escalation came not through confrontation, but through omission. The slow peeling away of involvement, the quiet opting out my son practiced with the precision of a man removing himself from a photograph, so subtly you only notice he's gone. When you try to remember where he was standing, he began working longer hours, sometimes truly, sometimes dubiously, and when he came home, he walked past the baby with a nod of acknowledgement rather than the softening expression you expect from a father returning to his child. Dinner conversations became strained, reduced to logistics, appointment times, feeding schedules, insurance forms that needed signatures. He rarely addressed the baby by name, referring instead to him or the little guy, as though putting a name to the child meant putting a name to the responsibility he wasn't ready to claim. At first I told myself I was imagining this shift, that new parents falter, that fear comes out sideways, that even good people retreat when overwhelmed. But the truth settled gradually and stubbornly, a truth I could taste whenever Daniel spoke. About the future, not as a horizon to grow toward, but as a burden looming over him like a storm system he wanted no part of. One evening, while I was preparing dinner and Carla was upstairs bathing the baby, I overheard him on the phone in the next room, his voice low and curt, telling someone from work that things were complicated at home and that the baby's condition was more severe than expected, a phrase so casually cruel it felt like a slap. When the person on the other end apparently asked something sympathetic, Daniel sighed dramatically and said, "Yeah, well, we'll manage somehow, but it's going to change everything. Mom's basically moving in at this point. We're lucky she's still got the energy for all this." I froze at the counter, knife poised above a half-chopped onion, stunned not by his assumption of my availability, but by the resigned, almost martyr-like tone he used, as if he were already rehearsing excuses for a life that had not even fully unfolded. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling fan that spun too slowly to cool the thick summer air, and wondered when exactly my son had learned to outsource responsibility with such effortless entitlement, and whether this had always been part of him, or whether something in adulthood had hollowed out the tenderness I once believed was unshakable. The baby, meanwhile, grew in small, miraculous ways, responding to my voice with a turning of his head, reaching toward my chest with hands that seemed to know I would always be there to catch him. He had a way of furrowing his tiny brow when he concentrated, as if he were listening to the world with an intensity others reserved for sight. And sometimes I would catch Carla, watching me with a bewildered expression, as though she couldn't quite understand how I managed to soothe him so easily when her own arms trembled with uncertainty. She never said it aloud, but I could feel her slipping into the role of a mother who feared she wasn't enough, who feared judgment, who feared that failing even slightly meant confirming some terrible prophecy about the kind of life her child might live. Daniel, sensing this weakness, began making critical comments masked as concern, saying things like, "He cries less when Mom holds him," or, "Maybe you should let her take over nights. She has more experience," which only deepened Carla's insecurity and pushed her closer to collapse. The air in the house thickened with unspoken blame, the kind that seeps into walls and lingers like humidity. Each day I arrived earlier and left later, until my presence became less a gesture of support and more an expectation, built into the household rhythm so completely that when I once mentioned needing to return home for a few days to take care of my own appointments, Daniel frowned as though I'd suggested abandoning a sinking ship. "You know we're still adjusting," he said, his tone suggesting that my desire for personal boundaries was not only inconvenient, but selfish. Carla, caught between gratitude and dependency, murmured something about how she didn't know how to handle the night routines alone, and I realized with a sudden heaviness that what they needed wasn't help. It was absolution from the responsibility they feared would swallow them. That was when the quiet erosion truly began. They stopped asking me if I was available and instead assumed I was. They stopped thanking me for the long hours spent caring for the baby and instead treated my presence as part of the domestic architecture, like the stove or the rocking chair. Daniel's voice, once warm when asking favors, grew clipped, managerial, a tone he might use with an employee who needed firmer instruction. He began texting me lists of things to pick up on the way over, formula, diapers, special wipes he claimed were necessary, without asking whether I had the time or means to do so. Carla, overwhelmed and apologetic, began leaning on me for emotional support in a way that felt less like connection and more like desperation. She would corner me in the hallway, eyes wet, whispering fears about the baby's future, about Daniel's growing detachment, about the feeling that she was disappearing inside her own life. I held her, reassured her, told her she was doing the best she could, all while knowing that none of this addressed the root of the problem. The more I carried, the less they learned to carry at all. And through it all, the child grew, not in spite of his blindness, but alongside it, weaving it into the fabric of his being with a grace that neither parent was able to see. He followed voices, responded to textures, reacted to songs with a joy so pure it made my chest ache. Yet Daniel rarely witnessed these moments because he rarely tried. His avoidance, subtle at first, became a pattern too consistent to ignore. He chose errands, chores, phone calls, anything to keep him from confronting the reality that his son was not the mirror he wanted. One afternoon, when I placed the baby into his arms and asked him to feed him while I changed the laundry, he held the bottle stiffly, mechanically, and after only a few minutes called out, "Mom, He's fussing. I think he wants you. As though a newborn's natural restlessness were evidence of some deeper incompatibility between them. It was in these small withdrawals, these incremental choices to step away rather than step toward, that the first escalation took root, subtle but constant, reshaping the family dynamic in ways none of them were ready to admit. And while no one said it aloud, the unspoken truth landed heavily on my shoulders. The child's world was narrowing not because he could not see, but because the people entrusted with shaping that world were shrinking from it themselves. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind you forget unless something inside it shifts the axis of your life, and for me, that shift came quietly, without any grand announcements or sharp lines. Simply a moment when the fragile scaffolding of denial around all of us finally cracked and revealed what had been waiting underneath for far too long. I had taken the baby, my grandson, though by then it felt more accurate to say he had taken me, out to the small patch of sun in the backyard, because the house had become suffocating with unspoken anxieties and the brittle sound of Daniel's disappointment. And I remember sitting on the weathered wooden bench that leaned slightly to one side, holding the child on my knees and humming an old melody my own mother used to sing, when I felt his tiny hand reach upward, not searching blindly, but reaching with intention. His fingers brushed my chin first, then moved with surprising confidence to the curve of my cheek, tracing it lightly as though he were reading me like a map. And in that moment, something inside me rose like a tide, because he wasn't groping or flailing. He was discovering, cataloging, mapping the world the only way he could. And there was an unmistakable intelligence in the gentleness of his touch, an awareness that made the breath catch in my throat. When I lifted him slightly so our faces were closer, he responded with a small sound, half sigh, half laugh, that vibrated with a kind of recognition, the first sign that the work I'd been doing with him, the weeks of tactile games and soft musical cues, the hours spent naming objects and guiding his hands along their shapes, were beginning to bloom into something real. And when I spoke his name, calmly, slowly, letting the vowels stretch like warm taffy, he turned his head exactly toward my voice, not imprecisely or vaguely, but with astonishing accuracy, like a compass needle snapping to true north. I remember feeling the first true rise of hope since his birth, not the brittle kind people offer to one another when they don't know what else to say, but a deep, rooted hope that grows from witnessing potential where others insist there is limitation. And for a few seconds, I allowed myself to imagine what his life might look like if he kept surprising us like this, if he kept leaning toward possibility instead of shrinking beneath the weight of other people's predictions. It was right then, in the gentle warmth of that moment, that I heard the sharp crack of the sliding glass door and turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway with a look I couldn't quite decipher. Something between confusion and unease, as if he were witnessing a scene he hadn't approved the script for. He stepped outside with stiff shoulders and crossed his arms in that practiced way men do when they want to appear in control. And after watching us for a few seconds, he said, "He doesn't know you're there, Mom. He just likes the sound." There was no malice in his tone, but there was something worse, dismissal, the casual erasure of the child's effort, the refusal to acknowledge progress because acknowledging it would mean accepting that blindness wasn't the tragedy he'd framed it to be. I felt the spark of anger flick at the edges of my composure, but I swallowed it, choosing instead to place the baby's hand gently against my collarbone so Daniel could see the deliberate way he responded to touch. But Daniel only shook his head, as though the entire exchange meant nothing, and he muttered something about unrealistic expectations before turning back into the house, leaving the door half open behind him. It was a small moment, almost unbearably small, but it planted itself in me like a seed that sprouted into clarity with startling speed. I realized then that no matter how much his son learned, no matter how clever or capable he became, Daniel would always be looking for evidence that the world had wronged him, that life had deviated from the course he believed he deserved, and that the child himself was a constant reminder of that deviation. It was a realization so painful and so blunt that for a moment I simply sat there, stunned by the enormity of what it meant. I had been telling myself for months that Daniel was adjusting, that he was grieving, that he needed time. But grief transforms when it is given oxygen, and his grief had hardened into something calcified, something that did not want to move, something that would, in time, crush the child's spirit if left unchecked. Later that evening, after the baby had fallen asleep and Carla had retreated to the bathroom where she often lingered longer than necessary to hide her tears, I found myself standing in the kitchen with my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Daniel entered with the tired gait of a man hoping the day would end if he avoided looking at anything too closely. And for the first time since the diagnosis, I did not soften my posture or adjust my tone to make him feel safe. Instead, I asked plainly why he insisted on diminishing every sign of the child's progress, why he refused to see what was so plainly unfolding. He froze, mug halfway to his lips, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he set the cup down and spoke with a quiet resentment that stung more than shouting ever could. "Because it doesn't matter, Mom. Even if he learns little tricks, even if he adapts, his life is going to be limited, and ours will be limited with it. You keep acting like this is some miracle in the making, but it's not. It's just manageable damage." Those words hit me with the force of something physical, as though someone had driven a fist into my ribs, and I felt the air leave me in one long, silent exhale. Manageable damage. That was how he saw his child, his own son, an inconvenience that required mitigation rather than love. And as I looked at him, I saw not a father, but a man trapped by the narrow idea of what a child should be, unable to expand his heart enough to fit the child he actually had. I wanted to shout, to shake him, to force him to see the boy the way I did, luminous and full of quiet power. But instead, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you finally stop arguing with reality and start preparing to build a different one. I realized that if anything in this house was going to change, if this child was ever going to know joy, confidence, belonging, it would not come from Daniel's enlightenment or Carla's faltering strength. It would have to come from me. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat beside the crib and watched the baby sleep. His small hands curled loosely against his chest, his breath steady and soft. And I made a promise I did not speak aloud, a promise that unfurled inside me, like a banner caught by wind. I promised that he would not spend his life shrinking to accommodate someone else's fear, that he would not learn to apologize for existing, that he would not grow up believing himself limited simply because the man who fathered him could not. Imagine a world beyond his own expectations. I promised that if no one else would fight for his future, I would become the force that shaped it, the unwavering presence that insisted he deserved more than what he had been handed. And as I sat there, listening to the small, rhythmic sounds of his sleeping, something in my life quietly, irrevocably shifted from support to guardianship, from grandmother to defender, from passive witness to deliberate architect of the life he would one day claim as his own. I didn't notice when the tension in the house stopped being a background hum and started becoming the very air we breathed, thick and metallic, like the atmosphere before a storm that refuses to break, and yet the days continued in their familiar rhythms until something subtle but undeniable began to shift in the way Daniel spoke about the future, using phrases that felt less like concerns and more like quiet accusations, as though the simple act of his son existing had rearranged the architecture of his life in ways he had not granted permission for. It began with small remarks, tossed carelessly into conversations like crumbs he assumed no one would gather into a pattern. "We can't travel anymore," or "It's not worth planning too far ahead," or "He's always going to need someone around, so we can forget spontaneity." And each time he said those things, Carla would drop her gaze to the floor, her shoulders curling inward like paper exposed to heat, while I stood there with the baby in my arms, knowing that these remarks were not about inconvenience but about fear dressed as resentment, and resentment wearing the cloak of inevitability. I tried to counter him with small truths, mentioning the early successes, how quickly the baby recognized voices, how attuned he was to changes in texture and sound, how physiotherapists had praised his motor development. But Daniel always responded with the same weary sigh, the sigh of a man who believed every hopeful report was a prelude to disappointment. And he dismissed each observation with a tone that suggested I was indulging in fantasy instead of facing reality. A word he repeated so often it became a kind of shield against any argument that might force him to widen the narrow aperture through which he viewed his son's potential. The tension grew more pronounced as the child approached his first birthday, a milestone I anticipated with tenderness and awe because I had watched his small victories accumulate like tiny constellations forming a map, each new achievement illuminating a more complete picture of the boy he was becoming. But Daniel treated those milestones with increasing detachment, attending therapy sessions reluctantly, arriving late to medical appointments, muttering excuses about traffic and urgent calls from work. And when he did show up on time, he sat in the corner scrolling through his phone or staring into some vast internal distance rather than engaging with the specialists who were trying to help him understand the remarkable adaptability unfolding before him. The occupational therapist once asked him directly to participate in a tactile play exercise, and Daniel offered a strained smile before saying he preferred watching from the sidelines, a phrase that lodged itself in my mind because it was both literal and metaphorical, encapsulating his entire approach to fatherhood, as if he had declared, without admitting it aloud, that the sidelines were safer than the field, cleaner, less demanding, less prone to messy entanglements that required emotional presence he did not seem willing to give. It escalated further one evening when I arrived at the house to find Carla sitting on the floor beside the playmat, her hair disheveled, her breath uneven, her hands trembling in a way that alarmed me immediately. And when I asked what had happened, she tried to explain through tears that Daniel had told her he was tired of doing everything wrong, that he felt judged every time she attempted to help him engage with the child, and that he wanted some space to think, which was Daniel's code. for withdrawing into himself and leaving her to care for the baby alone, a pattern I had watched repeat itself so often that I could almost predict the arc of it. The irritation, the retreat, the silence, the remorse, the fragile reconciliation. And then the cycle beginning again. Carla admitted that she felt like she was disappearing inside her own life, as though she had become a caretaker of two people rather than a partner to one and a mother to another. And she clung to me with a desperation that frightened me because it revealed just how close she was to unraveling completely. I held her tightly and told her that she was not alone, that the child was thriving in ways neither of them had expected. But my words felt inadequate against the heavy shadow of Daniel's disappointment that seemed to seep into every corner of their marriage, every breath of the household, every choice they made. The true escalation, the moment everything shifted beyond repair, came on a winter afternoon when the baby, now a growing toddler, managed to crawl with impressive determination toward the coffee table, pulling himself upright with a steadiness that startled even me. He reached for a set of wooden blocks I had arranged earlier, running his fingers across their edges with the careful deliberation of a child discovering the world through touch. And when I named the shapes one by one, triangle, square, circle, he repeated the sounds in soft, halting murmurs that filled me with pride so intense it made my chest ache. Carla gasped with delight and covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes as she whispered his name again and again. But Daniel, who had just come home from work, paused in the doorway with a look that flickered between disbelief and something darker, something like annoyance at having walked into a moment of triumph he was not prepared to witness. He watched for a few seconds before asking, with a tone sharper than necessary, whether we were pushing him too hard. And when Carla insisted that the child was doing beautifully and that this kind of engagement was essential for his development, Daniel snapped that she was getting ahead of herself, that we were setting ourselves up for disappointment, that we were acting like blindness is a minor inconvenience rather than a lifelong limitation. And the way he said it, flat, factual, almost smug in its finality, ignited a fire in me so fierce I could feel the heat crawl up my spine. I turned to him and, for the first time since the baby was born, allowed my anger to surface without diluting it with politeness or restraint, telling him that he was not the one attending every appointment, not the one reading every research study, not the one sitting on the floor for hours encouraging small but monumental strides, not the one comforting Carla through her spiraling panic, not the one soothing the baby through sleepless nights or celebrating each new sound, each new movement, each new spark of comprehension. And I demanded to know how he could stand there and pretend he understood the child's potential when he barely participated in his life. The silence that followed was thunderous, swirling with years of unspoken truths, and Daniel, rather than reflecting even briefly on the weight of my words, lifted his chin and accused me of trying to take over, of turning Carla against him, of acting like I know better than the professionals. And when I countered that the professionals agreed with everything I had been telling him, he dismissed them too, claiming they were paid to be optimistic and that real life doesn't operate on therapy charts. That confrontation marked the point where Daniel began speaking openly about alternative arrangements, floating ideas that made my stomach drop, suggesting that perhaps the child would be better off in a specialized school, far from home where people trained for this sort of thing could manage his needs, And while he framed it as concern for the child's development, the truth behind the proposal was transparent. He wanted distance, space. The return of the life he believed had been stolen from him by fate, as though his son were not a human being, but a detour. Carla reacted with horror, arguing fiercely that she would never send her child away, that such places were not monasteries of enlightenment, but institutions where children were separated from their families and taught to expect less from the world. And I supported her fully, telling Daniel that what his son needed was not exile, but inclusion, not separation, but connection, and that pushing him away would only teach him that he was an inconvenience rather than a person deserving love. This disagreement swelled over the next weeks until it permeated every interaction, every meal, every breath shared in that house. Daniel became defensive, unpredictable, alternately sullen and explosive, sometimes apologizing for his harsh words, only to repeat them days later with greater force, as though he were spiraling between guilt and resentment without the emotional maturity to navigate either. His bitterness infected Carla so deeply that she began having panic attacks, moments where she could not breathe, where her chest tightened and her hands curled involuntarily. And more than once I found her locked in the bathroom, crying into a towel, so the baby wouldn't hear. One evening, after a particularly ugly argument in which Daniel accused her of sabotaging their future, she finally broke, sobbing that she felt trapped, that she didn't know how to be a wife to a man who resented their child and a mother to a boy who needed more strength than she believed she possessed. She clung to me with shaking hands and begged me not to leave, saying she was afraid of what Daniel might do. Not violence, but decisions he might make out of fear. Decisions that could alter the boy's life irrevocably. It was in this moment that I understood with bone-deep certainty that the second escalation wasn't just about Daniel's anger, or Carla's unraveling, or the baby's extraordinary progress. It was about the slow, chilling realization that if I didn't anchor this family, if I didn't hold the line with a steadiness none of them could muster, the child's future would erode beneath the weight of their panic and denial. And so I began intervening more directly, not with cruelty or accusation, but with strategy, guiding conversations toward understanding, pushing back against Daniel's fears with facts and possibilities, reminding Carla that her child was not a burden, but a boy blossoming in ways that defied every prediction. Yet, the more I tried to steady the ship, the more Daniel saw me as an adversary rather than an ally. And the tension reached a boiling point one night when he told me, in a voice cracking with something that was not sadness, but pride, bruised beyond recognition, that I needed to step back, that I was meddling, that he and Carla needed space to make decisions as parents. And though he didn't say it aloud, the message pulsed beneath his words. He blamed me for his own inability to face reality. He blamed me for the growing strength between mother and child. He blamed me because I refused to see his son as a tragedy. But the truth was this: I had already made up my mind. If he wanted space, he would have to earn the right to fill it with something more constructive than fear. If he wanted to be a father, he would have to choose engagement over avoidance. And if he wanted control over his son's future, he would have to demonstrate he was capable of shaping it with love rather than resentment. The escalation was no longer a series of arguments or misunderstandings. It had become a defining fracture, one that forced each of us to reveal who we truly were beneath the weight of expectation. And as I stood there that night, holding the child who had become the heartbeat of my days, I understood fully and without hesitation that I was no longer navigating a temporary crisis. I was preparing for a long, difficult battle for his possibility, for his freedom, for his right to grow unshackled by the limits of another person's fear. I remember the night it happened with a clarity so sharp it feels etched into the underside of my ribs. The kind of memory that does not fade, but settles into you like a second spine. And even now, all these years later, I can still feel the exact weight of the air in the room, heavy with the tension of everything unspoken, everything postponed, everything the three of us had been circling without the courage to confront directly, until the moment arrived when avoidance was no longer an option. And the truth forced itself into the open like a beam of harsh light cutting across a darkened floor. It began when Daniel came home later than usual, his coat damp from the freezing rain, the smell of wet asphalt and frustration clinging to him like a second skin, and he tossed his keys onto the table with a sharp clatter that made the child flinch, even though he couldn't see the gesture, only feel the jagged sound tearing through the quiet. Carla had been pacing for almost an hour before he arrived, anxiety burning through her like fever, her hands twisting in the hem of her sweater as she prepared to tell him that she had made a decision, not a threat, not an ultimatum, but a decision that would define the course of their son's life, and by extension, all of ours. She told him she wanted to enroll their son in a mainstream preschool program designed for children with visual impairments, integrated with sighted children. A program with extraordinary outcomes. A program that required commitment and presence from both parents. A program that demanded engagement rather than avoidance. And she spoke with a steadiness I hadn't seen in her in months, as though she had borrowed courage from some inner reservoir she had only just discovered. Daniel stared at her with an expression that chilled me. Not because it was angry. Anger at least acknowledges the presence of another person, but because it was hollow, emptied of warmth, emptied of curiosity, emptied of anything resembling the father he once might have become, and when he finally responded, his voice was cold enough to frost the windows. He said the program was unrealistic, that it would set their son up for humiliation, that Carla was naive to think the world would adapt itself to him. And then he turned to me, pointing a shaking finger as if he had found the root of all his disappointments, and accused me of poisoning Carla's mind with false hope, insisting that I had spent months undermining his authority, building fantasies, making promises that someone like his son would never be able to fulfill. The phrase "someone like his son" ignited something ancient in me, something older than fear, older than patience, older even than motherhood. A core of defiance forged over a lifetime of swallowing insults and silencing my own instincts in the name of peace. I stepped toward him, not to threaten, but to stand between the child and the storm about to break. And for the first time, I did not lower my voice, did not soften my posture, did not try to make myself small in the fragile hope that he might feel less overwhelmed. I told him that his son was not a tragedy, not a burden, not a chain dragging him into a version of adulthood he had not requested, but a brilliant, curious, fiercely adaptive child whose blindness was not the end of possibility, but the beginning of a different kind of vision, one that required discipline and courage from the adults around him, qualities I had hoped Daniel possessed, but no longer saw evidence of. My words struck him like blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. And truth has a way of exposing the softest parts of a person, the places they guard with anger, because to guard them with honesty would require change. His face twisted with something between grief and fury, and he shouted that he was tired of being told what a father should be, tired of living under pressure he never asked for, tired of feeling trapped by expectations that made him feel like a failure before he even had a chance to try. And as he spoke, I realized that beneath all his resentment lay a deep, choking terror of inadequacy, a terror so paralyzing it had curdled into cruelty. The child, sensing the upheaval in the room through vibrations alone, whimpered softly from the corner, where he sat surrounded by the toys I had carefully arranged earlier. Toys chosen for texture and sound. Toys meant to expand his world rather than dull it. And his small voice sliced through the shouting like a plea none of us could ignore. Carla rushed to him, lifting him into her arms with trembling hands, and the sight of her holding their son as though protecting him from his own father made something inside Daniel snap. He reached out, not to hit, not to grab, but to reclaim control in the only way he seemed to know how, by taking the child from Carla's arms with a forceful gesture that made her gasp. He insisted that he knew best, that the boy needed to be shielded from false expectations, that coddling him would only make the inevitable harder. And then, in a moment so shocking I felt the world tilt on its axis, he declared that he had begun researching residential programs for children like him, places where professionals could handle the situation, places far from home, far from us, far from everything the child had come to rely on. Carla turned pale, her knees buckling as she whispered that he couldn't mean that he couldn't possibly consider sending their child away, that such institutions were relics of an era that treated disability as something to hide rather than nurture. But Daniel's face was set, rigid with conviction or desperation. I could no longer tell the difference. I stepped between him and the door, voice steady, as I told him that if he ever attempted to separate the child from us, I would intervene legally without hesitation, that I would fight him with every ounce of strength in my aging body, that I would become the immovable force standing between him and the erasure of his own son's future. He stared at me, stunned not by the content of my words, but by the certainty in them. And in that moment I saw his fear exposed, raw and trembling beneath all the bravado, because he understood for the first time that I had stopped negotiating, stopped placating, stopped pretending he would magically become the father the child needed. I took the child gently from Carla's arms and held him against my chest, feeling the quick flutter of his heartbeat against my skin. And as I whispered his name, he reached up and brushed his fingers against my jaw in that same searching, trusting way he had done months earlier. And that simple gesture, the quiet, unwavering recognition of me as his source of safety, solidified everything I already knew with absolute clarity. I told Daniel that he no longer had the right to dictate the terms of the child's life, that until he was willing to see his son as whole rather than broken, as capable rather than doomed, as deserving rather than burdensome, he would have no say in decisions regarding his future. Carla, still trembling, nodded with a resolve I had never seen in her before, and she told him that she was done apologizing, done enabling his fear, done shrinking to make him feel like he wasn't failing, and that if he wanted a family, he would have to step into it fully instead of lurking at its edges. The silence that followed was vast, the kind that feels like standing on the edge of a cliff after an earthquake, surveying the altered landscape and realizing nothing will ever be the same. And in that silence, Daniel's shoulders finally sagged, the fight draining from him like water from a cracked vessel. He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands, and for the first time since his son was born, he wept. Not from sorrow, not from anger, but from the realization that he had been running from himself, not from the child. I placed the boy in Carla's arms and walked to the window, breathing deeply, knowing that the moment had arrived, the moment when everything broke and everything realigned, and the shape of our lives shifted into something irrevocable. It was not victory, it was not defeat. It was the necessary fracture from which the rest of the story would rise. The years that followed unfolded not as a triumphal march, but as a long, steady rising of light, the kind that does not announce itself with fanfare, but settles gradually across the terrain of your life until one morning you realize everything looks different. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And I found myself watching the boy grow with a fascination that bordered on awe. For each new day brought a discovery I could never have predicted. Small proofs that the human spirit, when nurtured rather than feared, expands in directions no limitation can contain. He learned to navigate rooms through echo and memory, moving with a confidence that made visitors pause in astonishment. He absorbed language greedily, rolling new words across his tongue like textures, savoring them, testing the shape of meaning. He developed an instinct for patterns and arguments that revealed a mind wired for logic, precision, and discipline. And I often caught him murmuring little debates with himself, rehearsing arguments the way other children rehearsed games of make-believe. It became clear long before he understood it himself that his blindness had not narrowed his world, but sharpened his intellect, focusing his attention on details others overlooked, granting him a clarity his father had never imagined possible. Daniel, for his part, did not transform overnight, for people do not shed their fears like old coats simply because they have been confronted. But something in him softened after that night. Some rigid part of him cracked open, and although he stumbled often, retreating at times into old patterns of avoidance or pessimism, he began, slowly and haltingly, to sit with his son during therapy sessions, to listen without arguing when specialists spoke, to ask questions whose tone carried more curiosity than dread. And even though he did not always understand what he was being asked to do, he tried, and trying, for a man who had once fled from the very idea of responsibility, was its own kind of rebuilding. I never praised him for seeking redemption, and never punished him when he faltered. I simply allowed him to step forward at his own pace, knowing that healing that is forced becomes performance, while healing chosen becomes change. Over time, his relationship with the boy grew from reluctant participation to genuine connection, and though he would never admit it aloud, I sometimes saw flashes of gratitude in his expression when he watched me working with the child, as if he understood, finally, that love had saved all three of us from the narrowness of his fear. Carla emerged from those early years transformed in her own right, no longer the trembling young mother overwhelmed by shadows, but a woman honed by adversity into something stronger, steadier, and more luminous than she ever believed she could be. And I watched with pride as she took ownership of her son's education, advocating for him with a voice that no longer cracked under pressure, learning the vocabulary of rights and accommodations, memorizing every statute that ensured his inclusion, until she became a force that even Daniel deferred to. Together, She and I formed an unspoken alliance, not against him, but for the child. Each of us driven by a fierce devotion that no conflict could dilute. And through that alliance, a sense of peace eventually settled into the house. Not a perfect peace, but a functional one, the kind built from mutual effort rather than illusion. As the boy grew, his curiosity deepened into a relentless hunger for knowledge, a hunger that carried him through school, into debate clubs, through hours of reading with his fingertips and listening to recordings at speeds that astounded even his teachers. And I became accustomed to hearing him rehearse oral arguments under his breath while pacing the living room with the grace of someone who felt sound more than space. There were moments, many of them, when I caught him tilting his head toward the window, sensing sunlight not through sight but through warmth. And in those moments, I saw something in him that felt prophetic, as though he were reaching for a world larger than any of us had imagined when he was first placed into my arms. And then came the morning, years later, when he stood before the Supreme Court, flawlessly articulated, composed in a way that belied his youth, arguing a case with a precision that made even the most seasoned justices lean forward. And as I sat in the gallery, listening to the strong, unwavering cadence of his voice filling that vast chamber, I felt the full weight of the journey that had led us there, the grief that had birthed strength, the conflict that had carved clarity, the love that had insisted on possibility where others saw only the outline of loss. I thought of Daniel sitting 2 rows behind me, his hands clasped tightly, pride radiating from him like heat. And I knew that although he had taken a long road toward acceptance, he was here now, present, humbled, changed. I thought of Carla, tears shining on her lashes as she mouthed words of encouragement he could not see, but could certainly hear. And I felt the quiet triumph of knowing that none of us had surrendered to the fear that once threatened to fracture us beyond repair. When it was over and he found me in the corridor, he did not ask how he had done, for he didn't need to. Instead, he reached for my hand with that same instinctive certainty he had as a baby, curling his fingers around mine in a gesture of recognition and gratitude that needed no spoken explanation. I told him softly that he had done what many sighted people spend their whole lives too afraid to attempt, that he had seen himself clearly long before others learned to see him. And he smiled. Not a broad smile, but the quiet kind that anchors itself in the heart of the person who receives it. And as I walked beside him, guiding him through the echoing hallways with the gentle pressure of my arm against his, I realized that this was the peace I had longed for. Not the peace of forgiveness or reconciliation, but the peace of knowing that I had kept my promise to him, the promise I whispered into his tiny ear on the night his father called him a burden. So now, when the house is still and I sit alone with the memory of all that has passed, I think of every woman who has ever been told that her child or grandchild is too heavy to carry, too complicated to love, too different to fight for. And I want to tell her that weight is not the enemy. Fear is. And fear, when faced with love that refuses to yield, becomes something small enough to step over.